The Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation Subcommittee on Oceans and Atmosphere and Fisheries Coast Guard will come to order. Today we're having a hearing on the environmental and economic impacts of ocean acidification. And welcome to our panelists here. We appreciate them testifying before us today, and we will introduce them shortly. We live on a blue planet. And on this day, the 40th anniversary of Earth Day, it's no coincidence that we are focusing our attention on our oceans. They are 70% of the Earth's surface and provide a foundation for all of life. And yet there is a grave threat that lies hidden beneath the surface called ocean acidification. And since the start of the Industrial Revolution, humans have increased the global atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration by 35%. But carbon dioxide is not only accumulating in our atmosphere, it is being absorbed by our oceans. Approximately 1/4 of our global carbon dioxide emissions end up in oceans, and we know now that this is changing the very chemistry of our oceans. And while the full implications of these changes are unclear, the initial signs are frightening. As seawater becomes more acidic, it begins to withhold the basic chemical building blocks needed by marine organisms. Scientists predict that more acidic ocean could dissolve the shells of tiny organisms that make up the base of the ocean's food chain. And when it comes to ocean acidification, we are not just damaging the ocean's ecosystem, we are threatening its very foundation. And even though these changes are occurring out of sight and below the surface of the ocean, we are starting to see some of the very worrying signs. And that's what this hearing today is to discuss. In May 2008, I held a field hearing in Seattle of this subcommittee to examine the impacts of ocean acidification and climate change on Washington State's marine environment. The most vivid testimony came from one of my constituents, a fifth-generation shellfish farmer named Brett Bishop. Mr. Bishop's family shellfish farm is on the Little Skookum Bay in Mason County. His parents live next door, and his 2 teenage sons are 6th generation to live on that homestead and grow clams and oysters. And over the past several years, ocean acidification decimated the source of oyster by dissolving the larvae shells and increasing the susceptibility to dangerous marine bacteria. Damaged natural reproduction coupled with failing oyster hatcheries is threatening the entire shellfish industry in the Pacific Northwest. Generations of Brett Bishop's family have invested everything they have into their family farm, growing shellfish for 126 years. And if ocean acidification prevents the Bishop family from growing shellfish, they will lose their farm, their home, and 6 generations of hard work, hopes, and dreams. Today I received a letter from the shellfish growers, commercial fishermen, seafood industry representatives from across the United States requesting that Congress work to mitigate the cause and reduction the economic harm resulting from ocean acidification. I want to read just a paragraph from that letter because I think it sums up today's hearing. Quote, while some organisms are likely to be more adaptive than others to high CO2 oceans, seafood producers and consumers cannot afford to whistle in the dark about these changes. The U.S. seafood industry generates approximately $60 billion annually, fueling jobs and businesses that sustain thousands of families along the Gulf, Atlantic, Pacific, and ocean and Alaskan coasts. Even for the fisheries, where no direct harm from acidification has yet been documented, the disturbing signs of trouble on the front lines reveal a very compelling case to prevent the impacts from spreading and growing more severe. Stories like the Bishop family and this letter is why we called this hearing today, so this subcommittee can look at the threats, challenges, and questions posed by ocean acidification to our coastal communities, to the businesses and the people who rely on these healthy systems. It is also why this committee worked so hard to enact legislation Senator Lautenberg in his Federal Ocean Acidification Research and Monitoring Act, which I was proud to co-sponsor. That law established the nation's first comprehensive program to specifically study ocean acidification. And there he is, on cue. We're glad to see you. Ocean acidification is real, and there is a clear link between our society's carbon emission and the resulting change in the chemistry's ocean. Fortunately, we can slow down this process by ending our dangerous over-reliance on fossil fuel and transitioning to a cleaner, more diverse energy source. This effort has been one of my top priorities, and I will continue to fight to craft responsible, effective, bipartisan legislation to move us forward. Doing so is not only vital for our oceans and our environment, but for people like Brett Bishop and some of our witnesses who are here today, Mr. Waters and Mr. Ingram, but also for our nation's long-term economy and our sustainability. So again, I would like to thank the witnesses for being here. Thank you, Ms. Weaver. Let me add my thanks to you for your leadership on this issue. In Washington State, we have a statement that environmentalists make great ancestors, and think that you are. I think that your stewardship is about helping us take care of the planet. So thank you for being here on Earth Day and for your active effort in helping to explain this to many people who yet need to be convinced. So thank you. I'm going to start off, and let's just jump right into it, Dr. Barry. Dr. Everett claims that oceans will, never truly become acidic below a pH below 7, and therefore the term is somewhat misleading. But isn't this really about not the acidification level, but the chemistry of the oceans itself? And as Mr. Waters correctly put it, why would we risk waiting to find out when it's too late?
Well, the pH of the ocean, or alkalinity or acidic, it's really just semantics. I think if we went to the newspapers and said, the oceans are getting less alkaline, that's a little confusing, but I think something about acidity is something that we can understand. So when this term first came up, the idea that the ocean was acidic, it was understood by all the chemists. 7.0 is considered neutral, and the oceans are about 8.1 in pH. There's really no thought in the scientific literature or community that the oceans are acidic by that standard. They're becoming more acidic or less alkaline, but it's really a semantic term. Now, what is going to go on in the future is really what's important. How much change have we seen, and how much will we see in the future? And all of the predictions that I have seen, even the most conservative models, suggest that we will see quite large changes in pH in the ocean in the future. Now, think of it this way in temperature, because acidity is a little difficult to understand. But let's say that the range, because Dr. Everett talked about the natural range of variability, and he's correct that there is quite a wide variety, or quite a wide range of variability in some habitats in ocean acidity. And I'll say two things about that. Number one, what if we took the temperature range that we live in, let's say 50 degrees to 100 degrees, and we decided we're going to now move that range by 50 degrees. Now we live between 100 degrees and 150 degrees. That would be quite stressful for humans to live under those conditions. So we are basically asking organisms that live in the ocean, if all of the best science is correct about where we're going in the future, we're going to ask them to live in an ocean that has a range in pH that is, in many cases, outside the entire range that they have seen throughout much of their recent evolutionary history. The second point I guess I'd like to make with this is that Dr. Everett is correct. Environmental conditions change, and animals survive that. But it doesn't mean that they perform at their optimal point throughout that period. So animals might survive El Niños, but their performance, their survival, their growth, and their reproduction may be impaired during periods of their normal range that are stressful. If we shift that entire range over to a period where maybe they can tolerate the lower acidity, say the warmer part of it, but when it gets really hot, they're going to die, we have a real problem. So when we start shifting the entire environmental range, that's where we get into trouble, I think. And that's the comment I have for that. And
what do we do about that change in chemistry? I mean, I think your example is a good one. We in the Northwest always talk about this impact because we're a hydro system. 70% of our electricity comes from hydro, which means snowpack matters to us. 1 degree change in the temperature means millions of dollars difference in the cost of electricity. 1 degree. And so when you have this chemistry change, what does it mean for the uncertainty, and what can we do to address that? What are the recommendations?
Well, in the report, we recommend a program that begins with many of the recommendations that came from the 4M bill and the scientific community, and builds a framework of research that includes a variety of themes running from basic physiology. How do organisms make calcium carbonate shells? Because we need to understand some of the basic mechanisms, as well as trying to understand from the top down, will these changes in the performance of individual organisms scale up to what goes through food webs and eventually provides ecosystem services. And I can go into many more details if you like, but I'm not sure I answered this question entirely for you yet.
Well, I think I think the panel has done an excellent job. I wanted to ask Ms. Weaver about how she, got involved in this issue as it related to, to acidification, from the perspective of explaining it. But I think you all done, a fabulous job of talking about where we are today in the graphics of that food chain and what's at risk, and yet doing nothing and saying, well, let's just see what happens. It's just unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. So, Ms. Weaver, did you want to comment on your, were you surprised when you got more involved with this at the level of impacts to our ocean? Was it something you had been?
I think that thank you. I should know how to do that. I think that, I consider myself a fairly well-informed citizen and, someone who participates a lot in the water. And the fact that I knew nothing about this scientific data came as a huge shock to me. And it seemed to me that if every American citizen were given, could hear the testimony today, and could see this film we made, and certainly include Dr. Everett's testimony in this, that this is not an area, this is an area where we really look to our leadership to be informed and to take steps. I think that scientists are putting together different parts of the puzzle of climate change. We may not have absolutely all the pieces. There may be a couple under the sofa, but we have enough of the pieces to be sending out a cry to face this, to see, Mr. Waters' testimony is so moving, and it's very heartwarming to me, since I come from such a different world, to hear his testimony, seeing what's happening to his beloved finned creatures, looking ahead and looking at their future as a fisher person rather than as an eater and admirer like myself. I just feel that such power in this committee, even if we disagree on some of the scientific data, we're all sending the same message, which I think comes from all the citizens, which is we need your leadership, and we need your courage, and we need people to put aside whatever their partisan or regional view is and help each other pass this climate bill and get us toward a clean and renewable energy future. We just cannot take the chance that all four of us are correct. Only one of us has a different opinion. So, thank you.
Thank you. One of the things, we've talked a lot about fish, but if we could go back to the coral reef situation for a second, because obviously not only does acidification affect that, I'm concerned that it might prevent the coral reefs from even that initial damage might prohibit it from regrowing. And as people have explained to me, this is almost like our rainforest, if you will, for the species that live in that particular environment. So if you could talk about that, and then I want Mr. Waters and Mr. Ingram to talk about, well, what are the kind of early warning systems that you see that you think we should be doing as part of solutions?
Well, concerning coral reefs are certainly dependent upon calcification.
And I should just mention to people, we have many coral reefs in the Northwest, and my colleague from Alaska can tell you about the coral reefs in his areas. So.
Well, you also have them offshore in deeper waters, too. I'm a deep-sea ecologist, so I have a little bias towards the things that live in deep waters. But shallow water reefs certainly depend upon calcification. And when you couple calcification with, ocean acidification with warming, we've seen coral bleaching just due to warming. And if that persists for a couple weeks, the corals die. The reefs will remain intact until they dissolve. As we make the oceans more acidic, or less alkaline, then they certainly could begin to erode more quickly. And the tropical Pacific, actually, if I could get a slide up, this shows the change in the aragonite saturation state, how much saturation of carbonate minerals are in the ocean. And this is a little bit complicated. Oops. Well, this is a movie produced by Sarah Cooley at WHOI, which is the reds are areas, you can see the scale going from purple to red. Purple means that 4.5 means there's lots of carbonate minerals around to make their shells. And as things get lower, and corals, when they get to around 2.2, 2.3, below that it's becoming hard to calcify. If you go below 1 into the red, exposed carbonate minerals will dissolve just because the ocean's sufficiently acidic at that point. So as we move from 1900 at the beginning of this slide to the right at 2100, we see that the red starts to take over and the purples and dark blues disappear. And I think this will stop after this last one, and you'll see at the end, toward the end of this century, the conditions for creating calcium carbonate are much, much weaker, and the chemical conditions are not as appropriate as they are now or as they were in the past. Now, what happens in the long run? In the long run, when we make this ocean more acidic, that makes it harder to make the skeletons. There's evidence from different areas that are either more acidic or less acidic now. In areas where corals are living, where it is now more acidic, they cement that calcium carbonate more weakly, so they have more fragile skeletons, which allows more rapid coastal erosion, et cetera. And as you move into the future, if all of the areas that are creating corals are more fragile cementation of that calcium carbonate, that means that they're much more susceptible to erosion if they die or when they die. And so if you add warming on top of the story, all of a sudden we have a bunch of reefs that are now dead that could be eroded. Now, there's no certainty that that's going to happen, but there's quite a bit of worry in the scientific community, particularly about shallow water or tropical coral reefs. That being said, once you change that reef structure, because they're such an important structure-forming part of the community, everything else can change with it. So instead of a coral-dominated community with all the animals that you have now and plants, you start to get an algal-dominated community, which has a whole different suite of things that may be completely different in terms of its ecology, completely different for the services it provides in terms of scuba divers, fishing, coastline protection, or even as a source of biodiversity that pharmaceutical companies are interested in to try and look for new medicines. So in a kind of a wide-ranging tome, there's my answer for you.
Thank you. Mr. Waters, early warning systems, what should we be doing, or what do you think the fishing industry sees as ways to participate in helping with this information?
Yes, ma'am. Well, so far I only know of one thing where the Coast Guard wants to do some baseline studies in the Gulf of Mexico. And our biggest threat is considered hypoxia, which is the nutrients coming down the Mississippi River creating dead zones where we're at. But I think these baseline studies would be just a pure minimum for the monitoring of the Gulf of Mexico. I would like to see some funding for some more active and more proactive monitoring to see if we haven't any kind of acidity change in the Gulf of Mexico, because like all these doctors are saying, the colder waters absorb the carbon faster than the warm waters. So I can't really sit here and tell you that I'm watching my fish die or my oysters die from acidification, but I also want to keep my eyes open. I don't want to turn my back on it, and I'd love to believe in Dr. Everett, and I'm scared to death of Dr. Barry. And so, I mean, I've really, my whole life, my family's life is all in a fishing community. And even though we fish hard against other fishermen and they don't seem to be your friends, if you ever holler Mayday, they are your friends. So at this time, we really need to keep our eyes open and have some fundings to monitor this in the southern regions, and I believe a little more proactive in the northern regions, and really see what's going on in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ingram?
I guess this seems to me like the proverb of boiling a frog. We don't really know precisely that somebody's turning up the heat on us just yet, because we haven't really felt it. And if we were that frog in water that was being increasingly heated, we would sooner or later find ourselves in deep trouble. We in the diving industry, there's 3.5 million active divers in the United States. And some of those people are scientists, and some of them have been able to help us to understand what's going on around us. We have a couple of environmental organizations that are very tightly tied to the diving industry, the Reef Environmental Education Foundation, the Coral Reef Alliance, and the Project Aware Foundation. And they do help us to understand what's going on. They very frequently provide us with information that helps to educate all of our constituents about what's going on. But I think for us, the biggest issue that we would need is to work with somebody like Jim Barry, like Dr. Everett, to help us to understand what those early warning signs could be. There's a lot of signs that we see firsthand, as I mentioned before, that are signs that there's something wrong. There's coral bleaching that's taking place. We see, unfortunately, trash on the bottom of the ocean. We see all sorts of different things from pollution that probably should not be there. And so when we do see those things, we try to do our best to clean that stuff up and get it off the bottom, and also report it to those organizations that can help us to keep our area clean. So I think for us, from the diving industry's perspective, the thing for us that would be the most critical would be for us to continue our education toward understanding so that we can help to provide as much information as we possibly can on reporting what's happening as the heat gets turned up on our frog.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ingram, and I will just say, I know, Mr. Waters, you're saying, this event has, worried on one side or listening to the results. I mean, you met one of our Northwest shell growers, and you saw what he was going through, and I can tell you, we don't want that to continue or to broaden to a larger group and classification of either the shellfish industry or the fishing industry, and that's why I think this letter from the shellfish growers and the commercial fishermen today that we received about how important this is and making sure that we come up with answers. I can't say to shellfish growers who've been in Washington State for 126 years, we're going to do nothing. I simply can't. So we're going to get answers, and we want to work with you. And I want to thank Dr. Everett, Dr. Barry, Ms. Weaver, Mr. Waters, Mr. Ingram for your testimony today. Senator Snowe and I and Senator Lautenberg, along with 20 of our colleagues, are calling for an FY 2011 funding for ocean acidification and monitoring and research. So we are going to be proceeding, moving ahead on this issue, so we thank you. We want to specifically thank you, too, for being here on the 40th anniversary of Earth Day. I think we all helped make sure that the oceans got their fair due in this big debate about our planet, that 70% of our Earth's planet being oceans, that not all is well underneath those waters, and we need to be good stewards of that part of our planet as well. So thank you for helping us illuminate that and for your testimony today. The hearing is adjourned.